Daniel wasn't lonely. He had a wife he loved, a golf group on Saturday mornings, people around him. And still, he'd just gone 7 straight days without a single conversation that changed anything inside him. Not one. The conversations happened. They just kept circling the same subjects: golf, weather, houses being sold, and his wife, the closest person he had slowly become the place where everything real went. Every worry, every doubt, every deeper thought. Without realizing it, one single person was carrying almost the entire emotional structure of his life. There was something quietly exhausting about that, not because she wasn't enough, but because no one person was ever meant to carry every role at the same time. Daniel couldn't name what he was feeling. He only noticed that his social life felt structurally thin, like a bridge that's still standing, but with less support than it was built to hold. And that feeling is different from loneliness. Loneliness is about absence. This is about shape. Because here's what most people over 50 eventually run into. You don't necessarily need more friends. You may need a different structure. Now, that's a claim. So let's do this honestly. I'm going to show you what the research actually establishes, where it goes quiet, and then I'll give you a way to think about the part it doesn't cover. Because the relationships that hold up the second half of your life aren't the oldest ones, or even the deepest ones. They do 3 different jobs, and almost nobody has all 3 at once. You had your big social years, your 20s, your 30s, work friendships, neighborhood friendships, the couples you used to have dinner with, and then, little by little, life started narrowing. Not in a bad way. The texture just changed. Daily contact faded. People moved away. Priorities changed. By the time most people reach their 50s, their active social circle has already shrunk considerably. And research suggests the shrinking started back in their 40s, slowly, without anyone deciding to let it happen. Here's the part that confuses people the most. You can reach out to almost anyone in that smaller circle and still have a genuinely warm conversation. They're happy to hear from you. You're happy to catch up. But there is a difference between a warm conversation and a conversation that actually holds something up. That was the gap Daniel was feeling. That's the gap most people can't quite name. And this is not a small thing. In 2024, the Lancet Commission on Dementia listed social isolation among the modifiable risk factors for dementia, with a stronger impact on risk in later life, after 65. Sit with that for a second. Not nice to have, not good for morale. A risk factor, named alongside blood pressure and hearing loss, which means the shape of your social world isn't only about how your Tuesday feels. Over years, it appears to be doing something to the organ you think with. So here's the question that friendship advice almost never answers. If you already have people in your life, people you genuinely care about, why does it still feel structurally thin? To answer that, we have to be honest about something. The research is strong on the ingredient. It is much quieter on the recipe. Study after study points the same direction. Social connection is associated with healthier aging and isolation with worse outcomes, cognitively, emotionally, physically. That part is about as settled as this field gets. But look at how that connection is usually measured. How many people are in your network? How often you see them? Whether you live alone, whether you belong to a group? Counting. And here's what stops you cold. By every one of those measures, Daniel was fine. He had a spouse. He had a weekly group. He saw people. He was not isolated by any definition a researcher would use. The measure said, healthy. The man said, something is missing. And both were telling the truth. That's not a failure of Daniel. It's a blind spot in the measuring stick. Counting tells you whether people are present. It cannot tell you what those people are doing for you. And that is exactly the question you're actually asking. So here's where I'll be straight with you. What comes next isn't a study. It's a framework, a way of thinking that we built at this channel, on top of what the research does establish. It's not a diagnosis. It's not a clinical category. Nobody is going to measure your brain scan against it. It's a lens. And in a moment, you'll know whether it fits your life or not, which is the only test that matters here. Because when you stop asking, how many people do I have, and start asking, what does each of them actually do, a pattern shows up. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. There are 3 jobs, and the third one is the one almost nobody talks about. Not the deep confidant, not the intellectual sparring partner, something that barely even feels like a friendship, and it may be the one you'd miss the most. The first job, the confidant, the person you tell the real things to, not the polished version, the real thing. The worry you still haven't said out loud. Most people over 50 have one, sometimes a spouse, sometimes a sibling, sometimes a friend of decades. And here the research does back us up. Work on social support consistently points the same way. Having even one person you can be honest with is associated with handling stress better than having none. 1, not 5. 1 is enough, if it's real. The second job, the challenger. Someone who lives in a different world than yours. Different field, different age, different way of seeing. Someone who asks questions you hadn't thought to ask yourself. This one doesn't need to be emotionally close. It needs to make you think. And I won't claim science proves this friendship protects your brain more than the others. Nobody has run that race. What we know is that new mental input belongs in the same conversation as healthy brain aging. What we're adding is where that input comes from. A person who doesn't think like you. And there's something almost funny here. People spend years trying to deepen friendships that were never meant to be deep, trying to turn their golf buddy into a confidant. And all that time, the relationship doing the interesting work was the one they felt slightly embarrassed to take seriously. The person from the book club, the former co-worker from another field, the one you see twice a year and somehow have the best conversation of the month with. That one. And the third job, the quietest of them all. The witness. The person who remembers who you used to be. Remember Daniel? The problem was never that he had nobody. It was that every real conversation was going to one single person. What Daniel was missing was a witness, not someone you tell everything to, someone who has known you over time, who remembers who you were at 35, at 45, who can say, this isn't who you are. I've watched you handle harder things than this. And notice when that matters most. Retirement, loss, a health scare, the moments when you can't quite recognize yourself. And someone else still does. You don't need that person every week. You just need them to exist, and both of you need to know it. So the question isn't, who are my best friends? The more useful question is, what job does each relationship actually do? Who do you tell the real things to? That's your confidant. Who leaves you thinking differently after a conversation? That's your challenger. Who has known you across a long stretch of your life and still chooses to stay? That's your witness. Most people who run through this will find the same thing. One is solid, one is partial, one is nearly empty. That's useful information, not a verdict, a starting point. And here's what many people realize too late. The missing structure often doesn't require new people. It requires seeing the people you already have differently. A long-time acquaintance, known 20 years, never close, may already be a partial challenger or a partial witness. It doesn't need more intimacy. It needs more intentional contact. One conversation with a real question in it. One phone call where you actually catch up. You're not building from scratch. You're recognizing what's already there. And now the part that matters most in a long marriage. What often happens is that one person starts carrying every job at once. That's what Daniel was doing without ever deciding to. Any relationship expected to be confidant, challenger, and witness all at once for decades will eventually feel insufficient as all three. Not because that person failed, because the load was never survivable. Distribute the weight. Let different people carry different parts. That isn't disloyalty. That's how a structure stays standing. One more thing, and it's the one people get wrong. Of the three, the witness is the easiest to let fade. It doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't need weekly contact. It sits in the background until it quietly disappears. And it is far harder to rebuild than it ever was to maintain. One phone call, twice a year, one invitation you actually follow through on. You're not maintaining a friendship out of obligation. You're maintaining a structure you'll need in ways you can't see yet. Daniel figured it out eventually, not through some dramatic realization. He called a former coworker he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, someone he'd always found interesting. They talked for an hour. He hung up thinking differently about 3 things he hadn't reconsidered in months. He still had one real confidant. He still had the same golf group. Nothing about his life looked different from the outside, but something in the architecture had changed. The bridge had more support. So here's what to take from this. The question was never how many people you have. The question is whether your world has enough structural variety to hold what the second half of life is going to ask of it. Someone who can hold the real things. Someone who pushes your thinking. Someone who remembers who you used to be. And here's the quiet good news. You probably already have more of that than you realize. It's sitting in your contacts list, uncalled. Maybe that's one of the strangest turns of the second half of life. You start out thinking you need to expand your social world, and you end up realizing what was missing was never quantity. It was shape. You don't need more people. You need the right architecture.